Hello and welcome. This is Randy with Excel for Freelancers, and thanks for joining us for part 5 of the Data Import Manager. I've got a brand new training and an exciting one at that. We're going to go over dynamic source, and that means you can have multiple source documents that you can import, all whether they're starting with, ending with, matching, or containing certain specific text, and you can have those in a folder. We can also delete those files, move those files once they're imported, or do nothing. We've got a lot more to show you. Dynamic, it's going to be a great training, so let's get started. Okay, thanks so much. I'm really happy you joined us today. We've got a lot to show you. We're building out this data import manager. This is part 5. If you have not seen parts 1, 2, 3, or 4 yet, I urge you to do that, and I'll include the links below in the description for those videos. Of course, if you want to pick up this application, it is free for you using the links down in the description below. Of course, if you have not yet subscribed to our channel, I bring you brand new videos each and every Tuesday on bringing Excel to amazing levels which you've never seen, so you may want to subscribe, and don't forget to click that notification icon so I can get you these videos to you each and every week with free workbooks each and every week. Of course, in part 1 we covered the data source, in part 2 we covered how to get the destination, and in part 3 we covered data mapping. In part 4 last week we did the run import. In this week we're going to go back to data source, and in fact previously we had one specific source file, and we're going to bring that into the destination. But what if you have multiple source files? What if you've got multiple files? You want to bring all of them into a single source, and you want to do that seamlessly. Well, now I've given you a way. All we need to do is click dynamic source here, and then we're going to go for a specific folder. As long as those sources, we can select a specific folder for those sources. So for example, if we have a specific folder here, as I already have set up, called source files, and we have that, so we can set up our specific source file, so it's going to have the ability to map any specific files in that folder. In fact, we can differentiate between those specific files with this little filter here, so we can focus on whether those files start with, end with, match, or contain specific text. In this case, I have a containing source, and so that means in this folder I've got let's go ahead, and they've been already archived, so let's unarchive those. We also have the ability to move the files after they've been, so I've just moved them back to source files now. So we have our specific, we have 4 different source files, except this one does not match, so because it doesn't contain the full word source, so that's going to be used as our test. So our test is going to run any file that contains the word source, and I want to pull any file from this specific folder. Once I archive with those, once I actually import those, what I want to do is I want to move those files to the archived folder. We can select a specific folder, and we can just browse for that folder right here in our specific folder. So I've got archived, so any files that have already been imported would go to the archive. In that way, we can always never duplicate our imports. We can always have only new sheets. So it's a really handy feature. We also have the ability to delete the files after they've been imported. We also have the ability to do nothing. So I'm going to show you how we did all those. We also have a bit of conditional formatting, which we have here. And we have a dynamic number of rows of data on. When we have, of course, dynamic sources, we may have different rows of data. So that's going to be dynamic. So we don't have the number of rows because that's going to be based on the actual number of data. Each one of our sources could have different number of rows. So we're going to bring that in. That's going to be dynamic based when we do the importing. We also had to update the mapping feature based on some dynamic features. So we've got that done as well. And I'll show you how we do that. And so I'll show you how we get all that when we run that import. When we look at back here in our new destination, we see that our destination contains a total of now 58. So all of our source files are now in here. In fact, it was 3. All of our source data came into this. So it's going to compile as many number of sources as you have into one single sheet already mapped out, already formatted out. So it's going to take probably what people spend hours of work on, and it brings it in a matter of a few seconds. So this is a huge time saver for those of you who are continually bringing data into a master data sheet from multiple sources. So this is a great way to do that, and I'm going to show you just how we did that. And in the upcoming trainings, we are going to go over how to create a template, so that in case you do this quite often, you can create a template so that everything gets memorized. And in probably week 7 or week 8, we're going to cover how to automate this process, so that how you can get your imports every day, every Friday, every first of the month, or whatever. We're gonna cover that entire automation as well. So we got that to cover in the upcoming weeks. So I do appreciate that. If you do like these trainings, of course, I've got a few products that you just may love, including a 100 workbook zip file. That's a 100 all of my best workbooks. I put it in a single zip file, and I made it just $37. You can pick that up using the links down below, so I do appreciate that. That helps keep these trainings free. We also have the Ultimate Excel Resource Guide. That's 1,000 Excel resources for you in Excel enthusiasts, and that includes 100 PDF downloads. It includes 100 utilities and add-ons, and just tons of great, amazing Excel resources, the most Excel resources ever combined. And we have a 15-hour dashboard masterclass that'll give you the tools that you can to get amazing freelance jobs, as our students have been doing who've taken our dashboard masterclass. Upcoming, I do have a mentorship program. I'm going to teach you every step from concept to cash and how to create your own recurring income stream. So that's coming up in just a few weeks, so keep that in mind. That's a mentorship. That'll be a weekly private trainings, private videos. We're going to create an amazing accounting application, and it's going to last several months, so keep that in mind. All right, moving on, let's get to the training. We're going to start off with the conditional formatting and how we created this particular type of training, and how we created all of these features in this for this dynamic source. So I wanted to go over that today with you. All right, it's going to start off with this dynamic. We have a brand new checkbox, and we've added conditional formatting. Now this specific checkbox, when we click the format control, we're going to see that that's tied to cell B2. B2 is we're going to focus, and that's going to be a true or false, a Boolean here in B2. So everything based on that dynamic source here. If we click it, it's going to be false. If we click it again, it's going to be true based on the selection. So that's the dynamic source. So we've got conditional formatting that's based on whether it is a static source or whether it's a dynamic source. And it's all going to be based on B2. So let's take a look at some of the conditional formatting. I'm just going to highlight some rows. We're going to go into Home, Conditional Formatting, and Manage Rules. We're going to take a look at some of the rules that we have set up here. I've also set up some rules that are based on required content, so we'll get into that in just a moment. So here we have, let's just choose one cell here, this cell here, so we don't have to focus on too much. Managing rules, we're going to take a look at this. If B2 equals true, and that means a dynamic source. If that is true, then I want to do some things. What is it that I want to do? Well, I want to color it the blue. I want to give it the blue background here, and I also want to give it the font color of the blue. So both the fill has that blue color, which is the same as our background, and our font has that background. I don't believe there's no border changes on this particular. So just those two things are going to change when that's true. Our background color and our font color both become blue, and that's going to hide whatever text is there, and it's also going to clear out, remove this white background and change it to a blue background. So just by clicking here. So, and pretty much the same thing for what I've done right here as well. As you can see, when you highlight it, you can see what text is there. And again, for those things based on the same thing there, if B2 becomes true, what I want to do is I want to just hide the font by changing it to blue and the background color. So it's relatively simple conditional formatting, things that we've been over many times before. And I also did the same thing for in dynamic source. I did the same thing here because our last row is going to be dynamic. If we have a specific source file, we know the last row it's going to be. We're going to be able to pull it up when we pull out the source file. But when we don't have it, when it could be multiple different sources, we may have multiple different last rows, different numbers of data rows. So that's going to be dynamic, and we're going to pull that last row using some formula in VBA, and we'll go over that shortly. But so that is not necessary, the last row of data. That once we do the import process, we're going to check for the last row for every single workbook. So we've got that covered. And I've also got some new macros here. When we click there, there's some macros. You see some buttons disappear, and some buttons are our hide, right? When we click on dynamic source, we want the user to be able to select a folder. What location are those sources going to be? So we want the user to be able to select a folder. I also want the user to select a folder if we're moving files. If we're deleting files, we don't have that folder. If we are do nothing, we don't have that folder. But if we select move files to, I want the user to select what folder we want those files to move to. So that's very important. And if you take a look at here, I've got some conditional formatting for this. In fact, there's two conditions for this. One, the condition has to be, should not be move files to. In other words, if it's not move files to and it's not true, then just hide these. So for example, you see it's hidden there. So that's one condition. But what about if I change this to click on the drop down, delete files, right? I don't want anything to show up here. So there's two conditions in when this may be blue. Let's go over those. When we go into the home, conditional formatting and manage rules, we can see that we have some different formulas here. And if we look here, we have in the edit rule, we have F11 does not equal move files to, or B2 does not equal true. In either one of those instances, color the background blue, color the font blue, color the font blue, and color the background, the fill blue. So in those instances, so basically what we're saying is only in one condition, only when this equals move files to and this equals true, do we want to show its black font, and then of course it's white fill here, only in those cases. So we have that. We also have some macros that are running. There's a macro that actually hides this particular select folder and shows it based on the change event of cell F11. So when I make a change to this cell, and only when I make a change to this cell, do I want this button to show up when the user has selected move files to. If they've selected something else, I want it to hide. So in case, so we'll go into that too. So that's how we do it. Let's go over the macro. If we take a look at this and we select, you hold the control, right click, and click assign macro, we will see that we have something called a macro called dynamic source. Let's focus on that dynamic source right now, that macro, and see what's going on with that macro. So we're going to go into the VBA editor under the developers, Visual Basic, Alt F11 will be the shortcut to get you there. And we have source macros. And if we scroll down our source macros, we have this macro called dynamic source. That's the one I just pointed out. We've got a few things that go along. So basically what I want is if the user has selected a static source, if B2 is false, I want some things to happen. But if they've also selected a dynamic source, that means B2 would be true, then I want some other things to happen. So that's basically it. We're going to use an if, else, then statement. So we're going to go over that now. If B2 equals false, that would mean it's a static source. Static source meaning just one specific source. When that happens, I want to show a button, select source button. I want that visible. And I also want two other buttons hidden. Select folder button and move to folder button. So again, let's go over that here. I want, when it's a static source, in this case static, I want this button to show up. If we right click, click on that, we can see that this name is select source button, that button. So that I want displayed, and I want the other two hidden. Which ones? These are the two that were here. These two, select folder, and this one, I want both of those hidden. So both of those have specific names. If we unselect one, we can see the name is select folder button. And of course, we also have move to folder button. So both of those buttons would be hidden. Now, if we unselect it or select it, we want those displayed. So basically the opposite would happen if it's false. So let's move on through. It's very, very simple. So we're either hiding and showing a set of buttons, or we're showing and hiding a set of buttons. Now, one thing is I only want to show the move to files when what? When F11 equals move to files, for example. Now we want to show this select folder, right? But what if we're showing delete? What if we have do nothing? I don't want to show that. So when we select and unselect, right, we don't want to show that button because move to files isn't selected. Right? We don't want to show that button because there's nowhere to move to. Same with delete. If delete files are displayed, we only want to show that button when the user has actually selected move to files. So when F11 equals move to files, only then do I want to move to folder to show up. So now when we select it, so I do want to run a check to see what F11 is before I decide to display or hide the select folder button. So that's just what we're doing in that line of code right here. So let's go over that with you. We'll bring this over here. If F11 equals move files to, then make this visible, show that button. Otherwise, hide it. So it's relatively simple. Otherwise, hide that move to button. So we really only want to show that if the user has already selected the move files to option. So that's it. That's it for the dynamic source. There's two other, we'll go over these real quick. These are just browse folders. All we're going to do is we're going to browse for the dynamic source folder. I want to browse for a folder. What is that? Well, that's the macro that just basically runs when the user selects a folder, which is this macro right here, select folder, and all it's going to do is select a folder. Same thing here, select a folder for our move to, same thing. We're going to click on archive. Let's select archive. And so we have archive there. So there's two macros that run those, and those macros have been assigned to both of these buttons here. So we can see there I've got two macros here. We're going to browse dynamic source folder. We're just going to set the dynamic source folder. It's already been set it as a file dialog. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create a file dialog folder picker, because I only want to pick a folder. I don't want to pick a file. I just want to pick a folder. So in this case, with the dynamic, we're going to give it a title called select a source folder. Then just in case the user has not made a selection, I want to skip this part and go right here. Assuming they have made a selection, we're going to make whatever they're selected, whatever folder they've selected, I want that displayed in H10. And again, we're going to do the same thing in the browse move to file. We're going to do almost the same thing, except this time whatever their selection is going to go in H11. So that's pretty much it. All I've done is so that the folders that they've chosen are going to go right in either H10 or H11. So that gives us the full path of the folder. We need those. That's very important because I've got to know only, of course, when the move files are. All right, so I think we've covered everything as far as dynamic source. We understand why the folders appear, why the buttons appear, and when we need them. Now we do have the ability, we can show starts with, contains, so that if we have start with right in our source and we take a look at our sources, well, look, let's pull them out of the archive just so we know. I'm going to pull these out of the archive because that's where we just sent, and put them back into the source files. So now they're all here. And so now notice this one didn't go because this one's not full source. So in case, now let's say we try a different format. Start with source. Any files that start with source. Now if we look here, none of our folders actually start with source. They start with data test. So let's try to run it now. I've already mapped them. So let's run an import. We're going to get a message that says no source workbooks have been found, which is correct. No source workbooks start with source, which would be correct. But they contain sec and probably match as well. Again, we try the same thing. Again, it's going to give us the same thing, no source workbooks. So we don't have a match either. So I think that's pretty good. But in our case, I just want ones that contain the word source. And if we do that, and let's just try do nothing so we don't archive the folders. And then we run it. Let's run the import. And now it's been run. And now it works. 57 rows have been imported to book 44. That should probably be changed because I've changed that to a name. I've given that a name, and that name is going to be new destined file. So we need to make that change just on the message. So we'll do that once we do in the code, import it to book 44. That's, in other words, our destination book has already been named. So we want to make sure that we name that correctly. All right, so we've got that. So the files that contain the source, now they're still going to remain here because we chose not to move them to the archive, which is fine for us. But notice it didn't include that. Now, and notice we have a total of 57, but what if we were to change the name of that file right here? Let's get rid of that space here. Now it does contain source. Now it does, right? So now let's run the import, and now let's just actually move them. Let's move the files to the archive so we can see. And now we're going to run the import, and it's all going to be done. Okay, now we see a total of 75 rows. Okay, so that's good. And we take a look at here, and now we see that only the new destination folder and all 4 have been archived. So just that name change, so it's working really well. Let's go ahead and move them back over to the source files. And I'm just going to change one of them. Let's do just so we can see that it's working. I'm just going to give it some different names so that it doesn't import this one. It's a good way for testing. So we see that it does work. Now I can't wait to show you exactly how that works. So we had to do a few things. There's a few code updates. And what I've done is I've actually created 2 different macros. I have one macro that's going to run based on if it's a static source, and I have another macro that's going to run based if it's a dynamic source. So I created a macro and just based on whatever value is in B2. So let's go ahead in the code and take a look and see what kind of changes were made, so I can show you exactly how to do this, and of course how you can make changes so that you can do this for yourself, and it's a huge time saver, especially for those of you who get reports or get data, constantly get data. And this way you can combine the data and create reports on it within just a few clicks. In fact, we're going to show you how to ways to automate it, so we don't even need to click this. So it's going to be completely hands-free by the time we get to part 7, 8, 9, 10. It's going to be completely hands-free, so that this program opens up by itself, that the program runs by itself, maps the data, imports the data, moves the files or deletes the files, and closes. And you could be asleep while it's doing all that. So I can't wait to show that to you. But don't tell your boss that you're doing all this. I want him to think you're working really, really hard. So make sure you don't tell him you got this little secret. All right, but I'm going to show you how to do it. So if you need to make some changes, you can do that. So I know it gets a little bit confusing, but just bear with me. I do appreciate your attention. I know these videos are long and everybody else is showing 5-minute, 10-minute videos, but here we get into Excel deep. We create real solutions for real companies. So that's what we're doing. And that takes time, and it takes patience. And of course it takes knowledge. And hopefully I can share that knowledge with you each and every week. Into the developers, into the Visual Basic we go. Let's take a look. We have a few modules, and you see I've got now 2 different macros, one called import data dynamic macros, and the other one called import data static macro. Now the static macro is the one I showed you last week, and that's how we run the import, but I've just added one little caveat here, and that macro, that button now, this particular button right here, run import macro, that is now tied to a specific macro here called run import macro, and that's the macro that's going to decide which one to run based on the setting in B2, based on whether it's dynamic or a static source. So now we've got that. Let's close out some of these other workbooks. So now we have just that one macro called run import macro, and basically it's very simple. It's just going to decide if B2 equals true, then of course it's a dynamic source that we're going to be pulling in from. So we're going to run the import data dynamic. Otherwise, we're going to run the import data static. And so here's the static. We went over this last week, so there's no new changes to this. So now we're going to focus on the dynamic. This is the one we're going to be focusing in on. So this is the one I would like you to take a look at. In this particular macro, the import data dynamic, there's a lot of similarities. In fact, I'm not going to go over every single variable or every part. All of these variables are pretty much the same except for a few. So we're going to go over the ones that were added. So I've added a source file as a string. That one's been added. That, in other words, it's comparative to this macro, the static macro. We have a lot of those that are exactly the same. So we're just going to go over the ones that we've changed, because the macro is very similar, except we're going to run a loop in this macro. In fact, we're going to loop through all the workbooks in this folder that meet our requirements. So the job is for us to go in these source files and decide all of the files in this folder that meet the requirements we want to import. So it's basically the idea. So we're going to run a loop through that. And so we've added some strings and some variables to help us with that. So we have the source file name, we have the source file, the source folder, of course that's important, and the move source folder. Those are all strings that we've added. And also we're going to work on the file system. So we're going to add in the source object and the source folder as objects, because we're going to work on the file system. So we need that. I've also added the total combined rows. I want to know the total rows combined. So I want to keep track of all the rows imported, which is the combined number of rows between all the workbooks, and I want that in our final message. And then I want the source workbook count as long, right? So I want that, the source workbook. I want to know how many, I want to keep track of how many workbooks that we're importing, because I want to keep track of the number. So we've added that. So that's pretty much all. Everything else is the same as far as the destination and the source variables that we're covering. So we're going to cover up, we're going to make sure, again, I'll go through some of these things a little bit quicker if they're duplicates. I just want to make sure that the mapping is done. We went over this week. If B661 is false, that just means the user hasn't gone through the mapping step. So we want to make sure that we go through that step. I also want to check for required or dynamic source fields. If E10, F10, or H10, or I9 are blank, if any of those are blank, then that means all the dynamic source fields are not yet in place and they need to be. So we make sure that we have a caveat there. So we're going to go to tell the user to go to import step 1 and we're going to exit the sub out. There are some required fields. So if they're not, then we need to make sure that they get in. For example, if this is blank, I need to make this yellow and make sure it's required. So if we try to run an import there, we need to make sure the message says, please make sure all, I spelled that wrong. I missed it. Let me fix that. And let's fix it. Please make sure missed a few letters there. Dynamic source fields have been added. Okay, so we want to make sure that we have put that in, so that's very important. All right, next up, I've also colored this in yellow. Let's basically, this is a conditional formatting manage rules. So if we said if B2 is true, meaning it's dynamic, and F10 is blank, then color it yellow. And I've done that for a few of the other ones. Okay, so we can just let's put in the word source again. Okay. So we have that now. So just in case these particulars are blank, we want to make sure that the user actually have put in a value there, because they are required for our dynamic source data and our import to run properly. They're all required fields. So that's all we did there in just this little if-then statement here. We want to make sure that none of these fields, E10, F10, H10, or I9 are blank. Next up, we're going to set the current workbook to the import workbook. I always want to know what workbook we're working on, just as we did last week. Set the import workbook. That's the current workbook, because we're working with multiple workbooks here. So we need to clearly differentiate between the 3 workbooks that we're working with, whether it's the current workbook, the import workbook, the source workbook, or the destination workbook. We're going to set the destination value. Those aren't going to change. So before we get into our loop, we need to get all the destination variables. Not much of this has changed here at all, right? The destination stays the same. So we're going to make sure the destination is open and do that and run all of these variables we went over last week. Set the last destination row. Add if the user has selected to add a new workbook. We want a new workbook to be the destination. We're going to create the add. Otherwise, all of this is for existing workbooks, existing destination, and these 2 lines are for new. So we're going to set, all I did in this destination file path, I'm going to set it to H10. I'm just going to default the path for the destination, the new workbook, to be in whatever the user has set. I just put that right in here. In fact, it's going to be in the source files. So that means the destination I've defaulted to this H10. That means that's where we're going to put it. You can create your own destination. You can create your own folder here if it's a new workbook. So we can put that in here. Maybe we'll add a folder here for new workbooks if we want a specific destination. But it's easy. It's fine just to put it there. That's where our workbook's going to go, wherever the sources are located. All right, so moving on, we have the ability to add the new workbook. We can set the destination name, the destination data row, the destination column, and the column. So all this is just a duplicate of what we did last week. So there's no difference. We need to create a new worksheet or an existing workbook new worksheet. So we're going to create a new worksheet here. If B1 is B4 is 1, and destination sheet name means new worksheet, meaning it's an existing workbook destination, but the user has said, hey, I want to create a new worksheet. So then what we want to do is we just want to create a brand new worksheet. So these lines of code do that. This sets the new destination worksheet, and this will give it a name. So we did all that last week. There's no difference. So we'll go quickly over that, because we did go over that. You can check out last week's. If you did miss, check out part 4 where we did go over that. All right, next up, we have the get the first available row in the destination. We know that that's important. That's based on whether it's a new workbook or an existing workbook. First row. Now we're ready to get the dynamic. All we focus on is the destination, and nothing changed in this code here. All this destination, everything between here and here is all the same, because our destination isn't going to change much at all. The only thing that we're going to be doing is putting data from multiple workbooks into that instead of just one workbook. So now we need to get the dynamic source workbook details. The first row of data, we're going to base that on F12. F12 is here. That's whatever the user has set is our first row of data right here. Our first row of data, in this case it's 4. So whatever the user has set. Now we're going to make a few assumptions here, because we're going to assume that our data our source data is always going to start on row 4. Now, if you have data that's completely different, this is going to be kind of a little bit more difficult. Not impossible. We can write more code. We can write more code to get that. But it's a lot. We're already working with a lot of code. So we're going to assume that all of the data that we're importing is in the same, starts in the same column, starts in the same row, and ends it. Otherwise, if not, you're going to have to write more code to do that. In other words, our source data, here's our source. Right? Our source data starts on row 4 and column, right? Every one of our source data is exactly the same. And that's fine. Now they can end, now it can have different number of rows. That's fine. We've written in, they can have different number of rows. I think we have this one, our source data ends on row 24. And that's number 2, and number 1 ends on 21. So they can end in different rows, but really they should start in the same. And again, I said we're doing that for simplicity. You can write additional code so that it's different, but it's a little bit harder and more complex to work with. So we're going to assume, because most of the time when you get data continuously, it's generally in the same format. So we're going to focus on that. This is really how to bring in multiple sources of data with the same format and bringing them into a single destination, Okay, moving on. So we have that. So that's why we're going to assume the first row of data so we can manually input these. Remember, the last row of data, that doesn't matter here in this case because that's going to be dynamic. But the first column and the last column, those 3 are very important. So we want to make sure that all of our source data does at least fit those 3 things with the same first row, same first column, and same last column. Okay, moving on. So we want to get those into variables, and we do that right here. The first row of data, the first source column, the last source column. We need to get all of that in. The source sheet name, I9, that's important. We probably want to make sure that all of our source data, even if it's in different workbooks, has the same source sheet name. It should, so that's important. If you need to write more code because it's different, keep that in mind. The source folder, that's located in H10, and the source file name is located in F10. The source file name is in F10. That is important. That's necessarily the full file name, but it could be a partial too. For example, if we wanted to contain, F10 is going to be our initial. It could start with, begin with, or it could be an exact match. If it's an exact match, I guess you wouldn't have multiple. Probably won't be using match because that would mean just one. Probably if it's just one in a single folder. So you'd probably use more like start with, end with, or contain. Now, if you wanted to do like for every single Excel file in a folder, you could just do something like this, XLS X. And then, of course, that would be, you would do end with into that case. End with, so that would be for every single Excel file in a particular folder you could import. So we could do that. So that gives you some idea of options. So we'll stick with the words contain now, and we'll show you just how we did that in a few minutes. So we do have that ability, so we want to first at least pull the start, F10. F10 is going to be our name, our initial name. We're just going to use it as a string value. And then we're going to work with it. Now I need to know what the user has selected. The next thing I need to do is determine where to put the wildcards. And the wildcards are going to be start with, based on end with, match. And we're going to use the select case for that, and we're going to use determine select case. Now E10 is where the version is going to be located, where the type is. The type E10 is going to be either contain, start with, end with, or match. So that's located in E10. So based on the value of that, we're going to add wildcards to this. So no, wildcard would be something like an asterisk here would be ends with, this would be contains, right? Because we want it to contain, or this, something like this would be starts with, and in this case it would be an exact match. So that's all I'm going to do. I'm going to do that through VBA. So in this case for contain, what I'm really looking for is we're going to have the asterisk, the wildcard on both sides of it. That's going to tell VBA to look for anything, any text before or after it, any text before or after it, and that would be valid. So in this case, but we're going to add those dynamically. We're going to add those in VBA through just a few lines of code. So let's take a look at the select case right now. In the select case based on the E10, if that case is starts with, then I want to make sure that the source file name is equal to whatever the source file name currently is, and then add the asterisk at the end. If it's end with, then we're going to add the asterisk at the beginning to the source file name. If it's a match, there's no asterisk, no wildcards on either side. It's going to be the exact match, no change in that case. And of course, if it contains, just like I had mentioned, we're going to put the asterisk before, and after. So it's going to change this source file name. It's going to add those asterisks based on whatever the user has selected. That's going to help us for our filters. Now what we're ready to do is now we're ready to go into the folder. Now what I want the VBA to do is I want VBA to go into this folder, and for every single specific file in this folder, I wanted to check and see if it passes this test. If it contains the word source, case, not irrespective, that means regardless uppercase or lowercase, I wanted to look for that, and if it contains the word source, then I wanted to include that on the import. So the first thing I want to do is I want to make sure it's not case sensitive, so we're going to run a little bit of a test. But before we do that, we're going to set the source object for our file scripting object, because we're going to be working with the folder, so we're going to use the file scripting object, otherwise known as FSO, to help us with that. So the thing we want to do first is set the source object, and also want to set the source folder object to the source folder. We've already defined the source folder up here in H10. So what I want to, because that we have to run through that entire folder. So what I want to do is I want to create a loop, and I want to loop through this folder, and for every time that for every specific file that contains the word source, I wanted to include that. Doesn't regardless of the capital or Z. This one of course wouldn't, because we've got a space, so it doesn't, but this one would, and this one. So this one would not. So there's 3 that it would work. So we're going to start a for each loop. For each source object, that means for every specific file in our source object folder files, that means for all the files, or for each file in the folder with files, do something. What do I want to do? Well, I only want to continue if a certain things. We're going to use like. Like is a great command, and like tells us that if it's the same, it's like in string, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to first say if the source object name is like, that means it's got a text match the source file name. If those two are the same, remember the source file name is the one we created up here with and without the asterisk. So if the file name is like that, but I'm going to bring both of these, I want to make both of these lowercase so that it's not case sensitive. In my test, it didn't work as well when I made them both lowercase, then because I don't want to use case, right? Whether it's uppercase or lowercase, I want it to match regardless of case. So making both of these lowercase does just that. So if the source object, the name of the file is like, means like equals, right? It contains this, because this will be respective of the wildcards. You respect wildcards using like, so that's really important. Then what? Then we have a match, right? So if it's not like, it won't match. So then we're ready to do. So then assuming there is a match, we can continue. I want to set the source file path. That's the full file path of our source object, which is the file that's making the match, and I want to get the path of that, the full path, and I want to put it here. Now what I want to do is I want to pull the name out of that. What is the name? Well, of course, the name is whatever's in this folder. Here's the name of the file, right? Data test source. It would be this full file name right here. That's the entire file name. I want that file name also in VBA, so that's going to help us. So to do that, the source file would be the directory of whatever the source file path is. So that pulls out the file name automatically. And next up, what I want to do is I want to set the source workbook. I want to count the number of workbooks, because there's certain things that I want to do. Like when we're importing the first workbook, I want to make sure that the headers are put in. But in remaining workbooks, we don't want to keep adding headers and adding headers. We only want to add a first one. So it's important that we have a count of number of workbooks. So it's important we know when we're on workbook number 1, 2, or 3, or 4. So that's important. So we're going to set our initial count, source workbook count, equals source workbook count plus 1. So that's going to take whatever it was before and add 1. It starts off at 0. So in this case, if it's our first file that meets those conditions, this would be 1. Next up, I want to open the workbook. And if it's not open already, if it's open already, it would create an error. So that's why we have on error resume next. Set the source workbook equal to workbook source file. That's going to set it. This will be an error if it's open already. So if there's no error, then we can continue on setting the source workbook as nothing, meaning no error. Set the source workbook to equal workbooks and open. So we're going to open that source workbook right here based on the source file path. Next up, I want to set the last source row. Remember, the last row of data could be dynamic, right? So we need to set that. We need to determine what is the last row of that. We can do that with this line of code. We're not going to use end XLF because we don't know what column has the last row, right? We don't necessarily know what column. So this will help us regardless of the column. It is going to help us get us the last row regardless of what column our data is in. So the source workbook sheets, the source name, we're going to focus on our source workbook and the specific sheet that we set. And we're going to look for any value using our wildcard, any value after A1. We're going to look even in part, and we're going to look in formulas. We're going to search by rows and search previous, and we're not going to match the case. And that's going to give us the row. We want the row. I want to know the last row with a value, the last row, irregardless, whatever column. That's going to tell us what last row, because I need to know that. So that's going to help us. And then I also want to know the total import rows. And the total import row is simply the last source row minus the first source data plus 1. That's going to give us our total import rows. That's going to help us when we import it into the destination. We need to know how many rows to import. So this total import rows is very important. Next up, we're ready to copy over the data formats to the destination. The last map column. Yeah, we did this last week. The last map column equals the application worksheet function. Now let's just go over that real briefly. But what I want to do is we're going to go over, we've already mapped out this data, but I need to know the last row. We need to go through all, I think we went over this in week 3 actually. We're going to go, and week 4. We're going to go through this list. We're going to start it at 65, but I need to know the last row. In this case, it's 72. So we just need to know the last row, so we need to know how many columns that we're going to be running over. So the last map column would be the application count day. It's going to count all of them and just tell us, in this case, it's 72. So we need to know the last, starting at 65, going to 72, so that we can run a loop. The table column equals the first destination column. We just need to set that. Remember, I also need to know what columns. When we're creating our destination, we need to know what columns to go over. Let's take a look at our destination file. Is right here. I need to know what column we're on, starting at 1, 2, 3. So we need to keep track of which column we're on too. So that's very important. In this case, 1 through 9, but we need to go over, and we need to know which columns we're going over. So that is going to help us there. Table column, we did go over that. That's not different than last week. Same thing. Check to see if we are copying over headers, and only on the first of many source workbooks. So we want to copy over headers, but I only want to do that if the source workbook count is 1, meaning only on the first workbook that we're importing, and B4 is 2. What is B4? That would be whether it's a new workbook, if it's a new workbook, new worksheet, or new worksheet. So either on a new workbook or a new worksheet, and only if it's the first workbook we're bringing over. So in those conditions, we do want to copy over the header. So this is going to run a little bit of a loop, and all we're going to be doing here is just copying over the headers, copying over the headers right here. Starting here and going over to here, copying over the header. So all we're going to be doing is taking our map columns starting from here, here, and here, and here, and we're just going to run a loop, and we're going to copy those into the destination, into right here, here, and here. But we only want to copy that over for the first time. Okay, so we know how we're running that. Close it out. Hopefully not going to need it again. Okay, so then the destination column, we're going to be, we went over this last week. We're going to take the destination and just bring in those headers. So all we're doing with these lines of code is we're counting column by column and just bringing over the headers. Now we're ready to go. Remember, only going to run this loop on the first workbook. This is not going to happen on any workbooks after, because all we're doing is bringing over the headers. So if an existing destination workbook and an existing, replace the data. But in case, if this is an existing workbook and the user has selected to clear the old data, let's focus on the destination. If it's an existing workbook and the user has selected to replace the existing data, then I want to clear out any existing data. So in that case, we're going to be clearing out data. So that's important. New test data destination. Okay, so we also want to give it a name. So that's important. So I want to clear out any data. We went over that last week, so there's no change. All we're doing is clearing out data. Now we're going to copy over the data in formats. The table column, again, we're going to run a loop again through the mapping, but this time we're going to copy over the data from our source workbook and our source. So each one of our source column, we're going to be copying over the data. So, but if it's, as long as it's not do not import. If it's do not import, we're going to skip that right here. So once we map the data, if the user had said do not import here, we would skip that row. So that's important. We need to know if it's a do not import and bring in all that data over. So we did go over that last week. So that actually hasn't changed too much. So we bring in the destination column, the range, source book. Again, we're going to focus on the source workbook sheet, and we're going to bring all that and put that right into the destination. That brings all of our data into the source. The only difference in this case is actually we're updating the last row, and we'll get to that in just a moment because we want to make sure that we don't replace any data. We want to copy it over the top of it. We want to copy it below the current data. So that's important. So the formats and the data, nothing has changed here. So we didn't change anything here on the copying of the data and formats. We're going to close the workbook without saving it, so we don't want to save it. There's no need to save our source workbook. We're not making any changes in our sources. Really no need to save it. And then what I want to do is I want to do possibly either move or kill or delete the files. Now let's put a little comment in here. Delete file if option was requested. Okay. So we're going to either move or delete. If F11 equals move files to, in other words, the user has requested first to move files to, and we also want to make sure that there's actually a value here, H11 actually contains a folder, then move the files over. We can do that right here. If F11 equals move files to and H11 does not equal empty, then the name, we can use this to file. Name, all we're going to do is change the name of a file path. The source file path, change that name as H11, which is, remember, the folder that they requested, and the backslash and the source directory, the source file path. So what does that do? That takes whatever the file is and it renames it to a brand new location. This one line of cell, which is H11, that's the new location, the new folder location, or the archive, whatever I've selected. And we need the slash, and of course the file name, the current file name of the source. So this one line of code, what it will do is it will simply take whatever is in here and it will move to right here in the archive. So when we run it, it's that line of code. Remember, H11 is where we've requested those files to be moved in H11. So in this case, it would be archive. So when we run it, all the files are moved to that. Now that's if the user has selected move to, but what about if they've selected delete files? If they selected delete files, then what I'm going to use, I'm going to kill them. Use it to kill. Kill is the line of code in VBA that actually deletes them. If F11 equals delete files, then what do I want to do? I want to kill the source file. That's going to delete the file. We may not need it anymore, so we want to give the user the option to delete it, and we can do just that. Of course, if they selected do nothing, then that's going to happen, do nothing. Now what I want to do, this is very important, I want to set the source workbook to nothing. I want to make sure to clear that out because as we run our loop again, I want to make sure when we back up here, when we're setting the source workbook, I want to make sure that it's nothing. Okay, I want to make sure it's nothing so that we can reset the workbook. So we want to make sure to clear that out because we're going to be adding a new workbook to that. So we want to make sure to clear that out. Next up, I want to update the first available row. When we bring in data to our destination, and if we brought it in here, I want to update the first available row to whatever available row it is. So we can update it so that we run the loop, the new data gets added here and not replaced. So we want to make sure to update the first available row to whatever is the first available row. And in this case, the first available row is the first available row, whatever it was before, plus the total import row. So however many rows we imported, plus the previous value. So we're going to add that together, and that gives us our new first available row. And that's going to help us if we import the next workbook. I also want to keep track of the total combined rows. And the total combined rows is the total import rows plus the total combined rows. I want to know all the rows that we're going to be importing because we're going to use that on the reports in just a bit. So next up, that's it. That's all of our, and this is our end if there was a file match, right? If there was no file match, no file, it's just going to go to the next. This is the end of our loop, actually. The next source file, now it's going to go back and look at the next file. Now it's going to go right here. It's going to look for the next file. If there's another match, it's going to check and go through all this same information. Again, going to go through all of it again. And for every single file in that folder that meets those requirements, it's going to import that data. Once we're completed with that loop, it's going to do that. Now, if the source workbook count does not equal 0, that means then there were source workbooks that were imported. But what if in case there were no matches? If there were no matches, I want to add an if-then statement. So if there were matches, do this. If there were no matches, do this. I just want a little message box saying no source workbooks have been found, just so the user knows that something happened. There were no workbooks that met the criteria. Remember when we changed this to match, and we tried the import, we're going to get that message box. No source workbooks have been found. So that was important. Let's close out that workbook that got created. And so I want to make sure that we at least have that ability so that alerts the user that no conditions of those were met. Okay, so we have that. So, but what if there was workbooks that were imported? If it does not equal 0, then do what? Well, in this case, what I want to do is I want to auto fit all of the columns. When we import data, maybe the data is going to be in different formats. The columns are not going to be fit. I want to auto fit those columns. So we do that. Maybe it's going to be here and here and here. So I want to basically do like this. Double click. That's auto fit. So I want to do that with all of the columns that were imported in the destination. And we can do that with just this one line of code. And so what I want to do is I want to make sure that they're all auto fit. So we can do that with this line of code. The destination workbook, the sheets with the destination sheet starting on the first row and starting on the first destination column, and then going all the way to the first row and the last destination column. So I want to take that entire range and I want an entire column and I want to auto fit all of that. So we can automatically fit it. So that makes it look nice so that the columns are all automatically fit, which is a very nice feature. And so we only need that feature at the end after everything's been imported, so that's outside of the loop. I also want to save the destination workbook if existing or save as new. If B4 equals 1, B4 means it is an existing, if this is 1, it's an existing workbook. If it's 1, B4, it's an existing. In that case, all we need to do is save it. We could close it as well. If we want to, we're going to keep it open. Otherwise, I want to make sure that we use save as, but just in case it already exists, I want to kill it. If the directory of the destination does not equal empty, that means this destination workbook already exists in the folder. For our testing purposes, it's nice because we have choose the name folder. So if it exists, then delete it. You may want to remove this. You may not want this file. If it's always different, you may want to add some unique parameters onto that. You could do a save as and then the current date and the current time, so it's always going to be different. That's kind of a nice feature. You don't need this line if the name is always going to be different. And what's a great way to make it different? Use the current date, current time, current number of seconds. You can do that. That way it's always going to be different. So you can add on that. Like you could do the file path. You could add that on the destination file path. You can up here when we've defined it, you can add that destination file path right up here. Here, what you want to do is you might want to add on the current date and the current time right in here into the name in here. So you could add that on, and then it's always going to be unique. So let's just give you an idea of what you could do. Okay, moving on. So once we've killed it, we can then save it as and then the destination file path here. So that helps. All right, next up, I want a completion method. And of course, E47, your import has successfully been completed, a total combined rows. And I've updated it now so that we have the correct workbook name, which would be directory of the destination file path. That is going to give us our correct workbook name here on sheet, and then it's going to give us our sheet name. So that works now. Import workbook, I want to activate the import workbook so that we can see that. And everything else is the same. This, in case there was a duplicate sheet, we went over that and this message box would come up. So now that when we go ahead and run our import, we can see that a total of 57 rows have been imported to the new test data destination on sheet 1. All right, so now we've covered that. So now we see that we've completely covered that, and we now have multiple. Let's take a look at our destination just so we can see all of our rows. A total of 57 here have been imported all into our new test data destination. So from all the workbooks, and if we look in our folder here, we can see that our archive now contains all of the folders, and they're no longer in our source file here. Just our two destination samples, and of course our test source data that does not meet the requirements is here because it didn't meet the requirements. It doesn't contain the full source word here. So it works really well. Now we've made a few changes to mapped data format. Now we're going to map the data, but when I map the data and there's no dynamic source, what I want to do is I want to just pick the first one that meets those requirements. When we map the data, notice first, let's take a look at that. Oh, we need to move our archive back in so that we can get some source data back into the source files. So now that we have it, now we have some test data to work with. So now we can map the data. And what I want to do is, since there's no specific source here, we need to at least pull one so that we can map the data. So when we click map data, what it's going to do is going to pull the first one. So let's take a quick look at that so we can see the changes in the map data so that we can pull just the first match and pull whatever samples. It's nice because it's going to take the first match, it's going to figure out some mapping based on just the first one. So back into the VBA, let's take a look at the module here called data mapping macros, and I've added just two different ones here. I've added this is easy for you to see, a source folder and a source file name. Those are the only two variables that I've added here. Now we're going to add something called check for static or dynamic source. So that's a change here. So if B2 equals false, then it's a static source. Then our source file path is E8. We already have that. But what if it's a dynamic source? What if there's multiple sources? Then we need to just pull one out. Again, what I need to do is I need to define the source name in F10. Remember, that's our word. That's our starting source name. We're going to run the same case. We're going to add those asterisks, add those wildcards on based to whatever the user has selected, start with, and with match or contain. So we've added those asterisks on, and then I've set the source folder to H10. Remember, our source folder is H10 right here in H10. Just so we know, we need that source folder at H10. I need to know which folder to look back into that. The source, set the source object. We're going to create a scripting object because I got to look in the folder, and we're going to determine what folder we're going to set the source. That is going to be our source folder in H10. Then for each, what I want to do is again, we're going to use a like for each source object. We're going to stop at just one, but we're going to do for each because I want to look through every single file until we find a match. When we find a match, we're going to exit the for. If case is like the lowercase source file name, if we find a match, then exit. We're good. All I need to do is find the first match and then exit out of that loop. Now we have our match. Now the source file path equals the source object path. If no matches are found, an error will occur here. That's why we've wrapped it in on error resume next and on error go to 0. If no file was found, if the source file path is 0, why would it be 0? It would be empty if there was no file path. There, I need to alert the user. No source files. Remember, we just had that. When we moved the files over into the archive, we just saw this message. Remember, why was that? Because all of the files were moved into the archive, and there were no files that met that condition because there were no files that included the word source. So we just had that. That was because this was 0. So then we got the message box, no source files based on your matching requirements. And then we exit the sub. We cannot continue further because there are no files. Now, if there were matches, then this would not be empty, and then we can continue on. So what I want to do is I want to open the source workbook, and I want to get some matches. I want to open the source workbook. Here, now we're ready to move on. Now we've got the source file path. We have the source file path because it's the object path. So now we can continue on with the rest of the macro because now we have our source. Now everything else in this is the same because we've defined our source, because we have our source. Now we can go through the mapping as we did in I think part 3. Everything is the same because we've set the mapping. So we just had to pull. So all I did basically is, because we don't have a specific match, I had to find the first file. In this case, it would be 1 or 4, whatever in this case 1, it would find that and use this as a source. So all we're going to do is look in this folder, find the first source that actually matches the requirements, pulls that up, and then pulls that and brings that one into the mapping. So the mapping is slightly different. We have added that onto it. All right, so we've gone over and we've covered how to the ability to add dynamic sources. We've covered how to add conditional formatting to hide certain elements, hide certain buttons, and show certain buttons based on the specifics of that, the dynamic source or the static source. We also have the ability to show whether we're going to have start with, end with, match, or contain. So we have dynamic content based on the file name and how we can use whether those files meet certain criteria, meet certain conditions. We've shown you how to select a specific folder of where we're going to find the source, and also what to do with those source files once we've completed it, whether we're going to be deleting those files, moving them to a specific folder, or we're just going to do nothing. So we have the ability, and we've also shown you how to hide the button based on the user selection. In fact, I didn't quite show that to you. Let me show that to you real quick. Back into the developers tab, under our sheet, because that's a sheet one, under the data import manager, all I've added is right here into F11. This is worksheet change. If the user has made a change to F11, and if the target value equals move files to, then we're going to show that button. If it doesn't equal move files to, then we're going to hide the button. That's all we're going to do. It's the only thing I didn't show you there. So that's very, very simple. It's just a one line of code, basically. So that all that does is this, is when a user makes a change to F11, if that value, the change that they made equals move files to, show this button. But if it equals something else, hide the button. So that's all that we did there. That's the only code that I didn't show you. So now we've shown you that, how to hide and show the buttons based on the user selection. We have also showed you the changes that we make in map data so that when we have a dynamic source, we could find the first source that meets those conditions and then map that accordingly. And of course, we've added 2 different macros to this based on whatever setting we have in B2, based on whether it's a dynamic source or static source. And then we're going to run different macros based on that using a single button. And now we've updated the total. We have now total completed rows. So we've added that, and we've updated the correct file name here and then in the correct file sheet. So we've added all that and shown you how to add all those into the dynamic source. So we've covered a lot. Next week on part 6, we are going to cover, I think, templates, or we are going to cover automation. Probably going to add this to template. That way we can save. We're going to have multiple templates. I'm going to add a field up here that shows you how to select specific templates so that we can actually save all these templates. Probably on a new sheet, I'm going to have all the templates stored here so you can have multiple data import templates so that once we create all this mapping and all this source and all this destination, it's kind of a pain to create it again, but you're going to be able to select from a drop-down list of multiple templates. It's going to be really great. We'll be able to save the templates and edit and rename those templates so that we can have multiple different types of imports and we don't have to recreate it. So it's going to be really great. And then of course, I think on part 7, we're going to cover some automation. Maybe I've had some requests to add a filter in. I have another space. We may want to filter our imported data based on certain conditions. I may add that too. If you let me know if that's something you want to see in the comments below. I always appreciate your comments, your likes, your shares. That really helps us out. So I thank you for your continued support. Have a great day, and we'll see you next week.